You so much, Cheryl, and I've so loved being with all of you. So I've really enjoyed it. I'm very grateful for you to introducing me to the community. So just taking that biography for a moment, I get very British and embarrassed, but actually, and I don't normally talk about where I come from, but I think today it's important because you guys are kind of being my guinea pigs for taking a big risk. So, 13 years of my career, when I was talking about curating and delivering and developing programs, for 13 years, that was at the British Library. So I spent a hell of a lot of time in the British Library archives. And most of the time, it was programs I was being commissioned to curate. But occasionally, I got to do bits of my own research. And I was asked to research and teach the Bloomsburys, particularly Virginia Woolf. And I kept finding these Jewish moments and Jewish associations. So when I go to the Oxford Life Writing Centre in the autumn, it's the first time they've had a scholar specialising in Jewish women's writing. In fact, any kind of Jewish writing at all. And I'm so aware that two of the people on the board of that centre are Virginia Woolf biographers. And both of them happen to be people who are Jew-ish. And almost because of that ishness, they have been quite careful about how they talk about the questions of anti-Semitism and Jewishness around Virginia Woolf. They are both brilliant biographers with writing brilliant biographies, and yet that's a question that is not quite always treated, I think, as deeply and as complexly as it deserves. So I'm trying this out on you before I take it to Oxford, where I'm going to probably get a very critical reception, because I keep thinking that it's a much more complicated story than we ever talk about. So that's my starting point. Was Virginia Woolf and in fact, in her colleagues were her colleagues in the Bloomsbury group of anti-Semitic? Well, yes, of course. Was there something else going on? And did the fact that she was married to a Jewish man impact her views on Jews? Also, yes, of course. So that's what we're going for. We're going for a very Talmudic on the one hand, on the other hand. Let's do complexity and nuance today. And by the way, the reason that I'm putting her straight after Claude Cahun is, first of all, their dates are very different. They were born within a few years of each other and lived parallel lives. But whenever I read Orlando, I kept thinking Cahun could have been who Virginia Woolf was writing about when she wrote Orlando, about those questions of blurry gender and time travel and how you fit in with your society. So I don't know that she, in fact, I'm certain that she didn't know anything about her, although they did have some mutual friends in common. But that's another session. But it just made sense to put them together. So let me start with this question. So the question I've set, nicked obviously from Edward Albee's rather wonderful drama, is who's afraid of Virginia Woolf? And I've popped Leonard in there too, because in his own way, he was a very strong figure. And of course, he is the Jewish one. So I'm going to start with her, but I'm going to come to him in some depth today. So question number one is, why does she matter to us? And I think the obvious thing is because of her wonderful novels. And I found this New York Times obituary from 1941. So just after she died, the New York Times is saying no other English novelist has ever written more dazzling passages of poetry undefiled than Virginia Woolf. And it's comparing her to Shakespeare, Donne, Shelley, and Blake. You know, it's common that with hindsight we think of people as great, but in her own time, for kind of the paper of record to be championing her and saying a woman writer is as important as Shakespeare, Donne, Shelley, Blake, I think is phenomenal. So obviously she is a brilliant writer. And what she's known for, that last couple of sentences, I think, is so important. Steeped in the classical tradition, she was an audacious experimentalist. So she's really known for introducing stream of consciousness writing, where a sentence, a little bit like her colleague um, over the channel in Paris, Proust was doing, expanding what the sentence could do. He was tracing, for example, nostalgia and taste through his Madeleines in these long prose sentences full of subordinate clauses. She was looking at time and she was pushing those sentences to do the most creative, beautiful things. She was an absolute master of syntax. And I think this is because she studied languages, and I'll come back to that. And she's taken here as in the great English tradition. But for me, what makes her extraordinary and why she leaps into that kind of experimentalist phase is because she's actually hugely European. So again, I'll mention that later. But I think she's much more influenced, for example, by the Russian writers than she is by the British ones. So I'll talk a bit about that. They say she looked upon existence as a maze of paradoxes, but she was renewed by the transient beauty of the world. She loved beauty, but she saw existence as paradox. And I think for me, she herself is this challenging paradox, her life and her work. That's why I do the Talmudic on the one hand, on the other, because all over the place she throws me surprises. So obviously, her novels are what she was known for then. But you might know in recent years, a lot of the films and the books have really treated her relationship with Vita Sackville West. So there was a big film recently called Vita and Virginia. And her letters are now published as widely as her novels. And I'm saying that because I'll show you them in a little bit in a minute, but because I am now using her letters and her diaries, her published letters, her diaries, some published, some as yet unpublished, to make the argument that I'm going to make today. So I actually think looking at her nonfiction is important too. Just picked out a couple of excerpts from those letters. You have the very first one, which after they meet, Vita starts the correspondence in March 1923. And she sends her a letter addressed to Mrs. Wolfe. And Virginia replies, "Dear Mrs. Nicholson, but I wish you could be induced to call me Virginia." And Vita responds, "My dear Virginia, you see I don't take much inducing." And I think that is really the beginning of what is a long and flirtatious epistolary correspondence. But for me, the letter which really comes out for me and is important for me when looking at today is a reply Virginia writes to Vita in January 1926. So 3 years in, Vita is questioning their relationship because she thinks Virginia writes beautifully, but she doesn't always believe that Virginia means what she says. And this is how Virginia replies: "Your letter came this morning, but why do you think I don't feel or that I make phrases? Lovely phrases, you say, which rob things of reality. Just the opposite. Always, 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 I try to say what I feel." And she then goes on into what becomes very much a love letter. "I miss you, I shall miss you," lots of jokes. But I think that's really interesting. Always, 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 I try to say what I feel. Because when it comes to writing about Jews, both in her fiction and in her non-fiction, if she really does mean what she says, we encounter a problem. So let's look at this. So here's to start off with the case against her that is usually made. And the case against her pulls out moments from her fiction. So, for example, in her novel, The Years, a young woman is entertaining a friend in cheap lodgings in London. and they hear the sound of water being turned on in the room next door. The Jew having a bath, she explains. And the Jew, Abramson, he's a fellow lodger, she says about him, tomorrow there'll be a line of grease around the bath. And that isn't just grease as in, oh, he's dirty, but the greasy Jew is a very common stereotype at the time. And that word grease is a definite kind of anti-Semitic dog whistle. And she uses it in the way people like, who we know are right anti-Semitically, Ezra Pound, C.S. Eliot, Wyndham Lewis, she uses it like that. Now, maybe she doesn't intend it to be anti-Semitic, but she is thoughtlessly or deliberately absolutely buying into a stereotype. And that's not the only time. There's a short story she writes called The Duchess and the Jeweller. And I mean, the whole short story can be taken. But its central character, who's called Isidore Oliver, had started out, and this is Virginia's word, a little Jew boy. And I've put in brackets hooked nose and all because that's the description of him. So he started off in an East End alley, a little Ashkenazi Jew, and ends up as the richest jeweler in England. You know, spot your stereotypes here. There's also her diary entries. I said I was going to look at the non-fiction material as well. And if you go through her diaries, this is just a few of the phrases that I found. So there's general antipathy, quote, I do not like the Jewish voice, or there's another one, I do not like the Jewish laugh. I don't know if it helps us or not that both times she's actually referring to her mother-in-law. Um, her in-laws particularly give her a lot of resentment. So Leonard is born as one of 10 children. So he has 9 siblings who she describes as 9 Jews, all of whom, with the single exception of Leonard, might well have been drowned without the world wagging 1 ounce the worst. So not particularly comfortable, is this? And on her Jewish acquaintances, so I've just given you one, but I'm going to give you many more. Even the people she really rates, she can't help a little aside about. So there was the great Isaiah Berlin. She hugely respects Isaiah Berlin, but she can't help saying about him, a Portuguese Jew by the look of him. And I wouldn't say tonally it was a problem, except that it's one of so many kind of throwaways like that. So there is this kind of anti-Semitic strain that runs through both her fiction and her non-fiction. But there's a defense, okay? And here's the defense. So on the one hand, it's really important to think about context. So people had different attitudes then. Most of these comments were written in the 1920s and 30s. And as one of her father's biographers, so her father actually wrote biographies himself, and one of Virginia Woolf's contemporaries, Noel Annan, who was her best friends of her brother Toby Stephen, he said, you know, that is who they were. And he wrote about that amongst the Stephen family. Virginia was originally Virginia Stephen. He wrote about that faint contempt for Jews the whole family had, characteristic of their class. So, you know, people say one of those defenses people make is she's raised in a family, she's raised in a class, and this is their attitude to Jewishness. The other defense that is often made is that she's not as bad as, okay? And the reason I gave you Isaiah Berlin before, because it's Isaiah Berlin who says that. So Isaiah Berlin, the Portuguese, who looks like a Portuguese Jew, as she says. Isaiah Berlin writes about her and the Bloomsbury set too. He calls them the Bloomsberries, which I love. And he says it's a kind of club anti-Semitism, but it's not a deep, acute hostility to Jews, as in the case of, say, Hilaire Belloc or Chesterton. So he says there is this club anti-Semitism, just like Noel Anand said, it's a class anti-Semitism, but it's not as bad as the people who are really anti-Semitic. So the people who are really anti-Semitic are incredibly hostile, and the Bloomsburys are not. And one of the ways we know that they are not as acutely hostile as some of these other figures is, of course, because some of their best friends were Jewish. So I'm going to start with that some of her best friends. And of course, also her husband were Jewish. And then I'm going to take you through some of those other moments. So, Virginia Woolf's brothers went to Cambridge. Virginia and her sisters were educated at home, apart from her sister Vanessa Bell, who had a year at the Royal Academy. So Vanessa wanted to be an artist, and she was the only one of the sisters that was allowed by the father to have a little bit of formal art education. She, in the Royal Academy, felt very unhappy and out of place because most of the artists she really resonated with were at the Slade, which was the modern art school at University College London. And Vanessa Bell befriended an artist at the Slade called Dora Carrington. So you can see this one here is Dora Carrington, who ended up becoming a huge part of the Bloomsbury group. Virginia, Vanessa, their siblings Toby and Adrian moved to a flat in Bloomsbury, which is, sorry, an apartment, I should be a bit more American, that is 10 minutes walking distance from the Slade. So they were constantly seeing and meeting up with this particular class of 1912, which Dora was in. And I've pulled out of it some of the figures. There are very key British artist figures like Stanley Spencer and C.R.W. Nevinson, very well-known First World War artists. But there are also key Jewish figures in that group. David Bomberg here, who will go on and found the School of London. Isaac Rosenberg at the side here, you can see he's not quite in the group, who is part of what we know as the Whitechapel Boys. He's an artist and a poet. And Mark Gertler down below, who is the one who particularly becomes very close to the Bloomsburys. So right from university age, the girls have friends who are Jews, as well as their brothers bringing home from Cambridge Jews like Noel Annan and Leonard Woolf. So there is a big Jewish concept and context around them. Although Isaac Rosenberg, this one, will say about the Bloomsbury set, it's all very well for them to play the bohemian. They can afford to run riot for a couple of years and then go back to their roots. Their old life is waiting for them. Good home, families, connections. But we poor Whitechapel boys have nothing to go back to. We dare not let go. And what he's describing is that there is quite a lot of tension between the Bloomsburys and the Jewish students at the Slade because they have money and comfort which can make them afford not to take things seriously. His group of Whitechapel boys are walking because most of the time they can't even afford the bus to the Slades and back. And I'm talking about a 2-hour walk, really, from the East End to the Slade. They don't have studios. They go to Whitechapel Library after school. They can't afford paints. And he's like, well, these Bloomsburys play the bohemian because they've got their life and connections. But we, the poor Whitechapel Jewish boys, we've got to work really hard. We can't let go. We can't relax and play because life is much tougher for us. So
Aviva?
again, yeah.
Aviva? Just a question, if you can say a couple words about the Bloomsbury set and Whitechapel Boys, because those are phrases not everyone knows to put in context.
Okay. So when and I'll talk about this a bit more later on, but when Vanessa and Virginia and their two brothers, their two full brothers, they have lots of other half siblings. They have two full brothers, Toby and Adrian. after their father dies, the four of them move to a home in Bloomsbury. So Bloomsbury is in central London. Nowadays, it's the home of lots of the publishers. It's the area where you'll find the British Museum, you'll find University College London, Birkbeck College. There are all these squares. So at one point, the Stevens siblings live on Gordon Square, at another point on Tavistock Square. So they're living on these kind of squares, and the squares have a green common in the middle and then houses around them. So they're rather beautiful, and sometimes those gardens in the middle were locked, so only the people who lived around them could use them. The reason they became known as a set is Ottoline Morel. Well, there are lots of reasons they became known as a set, because they lots of their friends all moved to Bloomsbury. But what particularly happens is Lady Ottoline Morel creates a salon in her home. She lives, if anyone has been to London, the big University of London library, which is called Senate House, which, by the way, is where George Orwell worked during the war, and it's where he wrote 1984, and it's now loads and loads of British period dramas use that to film in. She had an apartment about three doors down from there, and the first real salon that she created, which where all these people gathered and became a group, which they called the Bloomsbury Group, was there. So they were the Bloomsbury Group, and it's because Bloomsbury is where they lived and where she gathered them. So a few of them lived a bit further away, but they always gathered in Bloomsbury. Whitechapel is the east end of London. It's on the docks. It's at the time, it's now quite up and coming and genteel and gentrified, and it's where a lot of the kind of cool kids live. But at the time, it was where the poorest people in London lived. And really, that is because the docks were full of rats. The water made it very unpleasant. So it was dock workers and poor Jews who lived there. And in fact, there was a whole Russian speaking enclave. A lot of those Eastern European Jews lived there. It's a bit like the Lower East Side tenements. And the Whitechapel boys were a group. In fact, there was one girl called Clara Winston, but it was a group of young Jewish boys who most of them were had to go to work from 13 or 14, but the aid society spotted their talent. David Bomberg and Isaac Rosenberg were how it started off, because they had a half a day free a week, and when they were 11, they spent their half a day free a week in the National Gallery copying pictures. And two wealthy Jewish women, actually with some American connections, the Schiff sisters, discovered them in the National Gallery and kind of asked these boys, "What are you doing?" And ended up financially supporting them. And they got scholarships and they got to the Slade. And they became very, very important artists. And in fact, Isaac Rosenberg died in World War One. David Bomberg would survive. He created what was known as the School of London. And the School of London included people like Frank Auerbach, Lucian Freud, the Kossoffs, all the big Jewish artists came from David Bomberg's School of London. So there is this very interesting thing, and people talk about them as in two completely different worlds, because no one, everyone goes, never the twain shall meet. What on earth has these poor East End Jewish boys got to do with these wealthy bohemian Bloomsbury set? But actually, they met and crossed over a lot. I'm going to particularly take on one of them. I've not been mentioning him too much, but he is the one who really transcends. The others want to go back to the East End and make life good for their family. Mark Gertler, who is at the bottom here, who is slightly different. His family aren't Russian origin, they're German origin. He's tiny bit more middle class. He's also a tiny bit frummer. His father was a rabbi. He's very ambitious and he wants to get ahead. He falls in love with Dora Carrington, and he makes himself part of the Bloomsbury set. She brings him to lots of Bloomsbury meetings, and he becomes one of Virginia Woolf's best friends. Okay, this is Mark Gertler. And again, people never think East End boy Virginia Woolf. This is that picture from the Slade. This is his self-portrait. And you can see he was rather gorgeous. So one of the moments in her diaries that most bothered me was her description of Mark Gertler, because I know that for 20 odd years they were really close friends and she supported his art. And yet, okay? So this is her description of Mark Gertler and someone called Cott, who I'll tell you about in a middle, coming to dinner with her and Leonard. Because not only was she friendly with him through Vanessa, but of course she marries a Jewish man who loves the fact that he can get other Jews into the household. Gertler and Cott dined with us. Gertler is a plump white young man, got up for the occasion very sprucely in sponge bag trousers. The word he would wish one to use of him is evidently powerful. There is something condensed in all Jews. His mind certainly has a powerful spring to it. He's also evidently an immense egoist. He means by sheer power to conquer art. I felt about him as about some women that unnatural repressions have forced him into unnatural assertions. He examined our furniture and pictures. He likes shiny lodging house things best, he said. He's never felt akin to anyone. He thinks himself very much cleverer than most painters. Cott sat indulgently silent. Okay. It's kind of complicated because she really admires him. She thinks he's powerful. But those lines like there's something condensed in all Jews, and also that he likes shiny lodging things, house things best. There's something that she's buying into that is from those old family stereotypes. You know, this very poor guy has come to dinner at their Bloomsbury apartment. They have this faded glamour because for the middle and upper classes, you don't want to be ostentatious. But this man who's lived in poverty, kind of, he wants shiny things because, I mean, and a shiny is her word. It goes slightly with the greasy. She sees him as slightly grasping, and it's comfortable and uncomfortable. And it says to me who Virginia Woolf is. She admires Jews. She surrounds herself with Jews. But when you look at her writing, if you believe she's always honest in her writing, there is something slightly uncomfortable there. Okay. So she's talking about Gertler, but who is Cott? Also Jewish. Okay. So this is the weird thing. Things about Jews make us slightly uncomfortable, but so much of her social circle is made up of Jews. So Samuel Kotaliansky, A Russian Jew in Bloomsbury is the book that is the biography of him, comes to her a slightly different way. He comes to her through Catherine Mansfield, who is a short story writer she befriends. But he is interesting. So again, just to complexify things, I'm throwing things in here that maybe offer another time. But this is the very first edition of the Criterion, which is the magazine that T.S. Eliot created. Okay. And T.S. Eliot, we always go, was anti-Semitic. But if you look at the contributors list of his very first published magazine, you've got Ada Levinson, Joseph Kessel, Paul Jacob Saul, Julian Bender, Jean de Menashe, Samuel Solomonovich Koteliansky, Humbert Wolff, John Rodker, and Max Jacob. Every single one of them are Jewish. So this is what I mean about this bleed between the Bloomsburys and the middle class non-Jewish literary set and the Jewish world. Again, all of them. My favourite actually is Ada Levinson. She's one of a family I call the Jewish Mitford sisters. But they're all really interesting Jewish figures. Most of them have disappeared from view because they didn't have champions. But in their time, Virginia Woolf, Eliot considered them as equals, and Samuel was one of them. So here he is with Catherine Mansfield, who he might or might not have had an affair with. They met because she and her boyfriend, John Murray Middleton, were living in lodgings in St John's Wood, and he was in the same lodgings, and she brought him into the Bloomsburys. He taught, oh, here he is having dinner with Ottilie Morell's husband and one of Virginia Woolf's brothers. But here he is. This is Virginia and Leonard have moved to Richmond, to Hogarth House. And here he is in her diaries, separate to From Gertner. Who have we seen? The usual people. Nessa and Duncan, Clive Bell, who married Vanessa. Mary, that's Mary Hutchinson, who's a cousin of the Strachers. The Strachers I'm going to come to in a minute. Stevens are her brothers. Carr, Catherine Mansfield. Forster, E.M. Forster, the novelist. I'll talk about later another one of their set. If you've read A Passage to India Where Angels Fear to Tread, that's him. And then she says, Cot too, who came to bring us Chekhov and was so excited over it and other projects as to twang like a fiddle instead of solemnly resounding as usual like a full barrel of beer. Well, I love this description. It's great. And I don't think this is tinged with anti-Semitism. So maybe Gertler really is problematic and Cott isn't. You don't know. But he's completely part of their circle. He's come to bring them Chekhov, the first publication of Chekhov's short stories in English. And this is what I mean about her European influence. So she and Leonard start taking Russian lessons with Cott in order to read all these great writers. I've just had my first Russian lesson and mortgaged my time to the extent of doing 3 lessons weekly. Leonard is mumbling Russian as I write, okay? With Cott and Leonard dragging me, I must be pulled through somehow. She's obsessed with her Russian lessons. She throws herself into them. And it's partly because she was not allowed that formal education. And in fact, one of the earliest publications when Leonard and Virginia create their own literary press, which they do at Hogarth House, the house they move into as their kind of family home in Richmond, they call it the Hogarth Press. One of the very first things they publish is called Talks with Tolstoy by A.B. Goldenweiser. Okay, so the Jewish interviewer of Tolstoy, and she has co-translated it with Cott, with the Russian Jew. So she loves Tolstoy, she loves Chekhov, and she loves the Russian Jew who teaches her about them. And she learns Russian together with not just her Russian Jewish teacher, but her Jewish husband. Okay. Just look at this. I sometimes think that Leonard and I are settling in too soundly. I can only keep up with Leonard by running as hard as I can. It's a lovely marriage. They're a little bit comfortable, a little bit competitive. They're doing shared activities, and that includes creating a press, studying Russian, and several more things, like hosting friends and family. This is a real marriage. So how do we get to that point? And how do we get to the point where she becomes surrounded by Jewish men in her circles? So this is Leonard. He's 2 years older than her, and he outlives her by something like 27 years, 28 years. He comes from a Jewish family, but they're a much more established Jewish family than the Whitechapel boys. They've been in London a couple of generations. And there's something really interesting. His father is Wolf. So again, that kind of more Germanic emigre world. But the mother is Marie de Jong, as in, and I've not been able to find out yet if they're related, but it's spelt the same as Erica de Jong, Fear of Flying. So one of my kind of things on my list to research is to see if there are any family connections. They are Orthodox. The parents are Orthodox. They belong to the local synagogue in Putney and Richmond. And in fact, that is the synagogue that Virginia Woolf goes to. So there is a description. I didn't pull it out for this because I had too much material, but there is a description of her going to synagogue for her mother-in-law's funeral. So again, we've got to not just assume that they were secularized. He does become more secular because of the 10 children they have, he is the most brilliant, and they pour a lot of money into getting him very well educated. He starts off at not great schools, but then they send him to boarding school and to Cambridge because they think he's the one who has a chance of making it in the world. At Cambridge, he meets and becomes friendly with these three people who are all intimately connected to Virginia then Stevens. So this is Toby Stevens, Virginia's brother. This is Lytton Strachey, who is actually Virginia's first fiance. Do you remember I said the Strachers came to tea? That's Lytton, and it's his cousin Mary who comes to tea as well. He is engaged to Virginia before Leonard marries her. And Clive Bell, who will marry Vanessa, her sister, who will become Vanessa Bell. So these become the group that Leonard finds himself in. And in fact, they call themselves, and gradually it grows to encompass other people, but they call themselves the Apostles, the Cambridge Apostles. And because they know that Leonard isn't Christian, they say the Cambridge Apostles and the rabbi. He is the rabbi. Um, he has a very different life to them. So they graduate from Cambridge, they come back to London, and they become a philosopher, a banker, and an art critic. You know, they are moneyed bohemian, middle to upper class. They settle in Bloomsbury near Virginia's family. Um, However, Leonard has to earn a living. He can't just go back and kind of dilly-dally and pretend to be a writer or pretend to be a philosopher. He is middle to lower class, so he's not as poor as the Whitechapel boys, but he has to support himself and, in fact, support his siblings. So he stays on in Cambridge and he studies for the civil service examinations. So the civil service is the kind of political kind of class in Britain. It's the political administration that puts policy into place. And he moves with the civil service. He graduates, becomes a member of the civil service, and he's seconded, because the British Empire is still in existence, he's seconded to Ceylon, what he and they in their diaries write about as India, but now it's Sri Lanka. And he becomes a cadet in the Ceylon civil service. By 4 years later, so he's still in his mid-20s, he's an assistant government agent in the Southern Province. And can you see him here? He's the white man surrounded by all the Sri Lankan police and officials and government. He is in charge. So because he is white and British, he is responsible for all these men, and you can see that he's at the centre. So he becomes very senior very quickly. There's a whole other kind of post-colonial discussion to be had about that. But for now, let's just say he's high achieving and ambitious. So he is given a year's leave because it's a long secondment, and he's meant to return to do another 4 years. But when he's home in 1912, he resigns to be with Virginia. So while he was in Ceylon, he'd written this book. He's a novelist as well. This is his first novel, The Village in the Jungle. And would you believe at this point in 1912, it's he rather than Virginia who is thought of the one who has huge literary potential. So again, that love of fiction is one of the reasons she will accept his hand in marriage. So I showed you this picture before, and I showed it you as him with friends of Virginia's at Cambridge, but it's a bit more complicated than that. You know, I said they live in squares. There's Gordon Square, there's Tavistock Square, there's Russell Square. My favourite line is one by Dorothy Parker, you know, that great wit. She said about the Bloomsbury group, They were living in squares, but loving in triangles. Okay. So that is absolutely true. So we've got Virginia, who is engaged to Lytton, but who is loved by Leonard. That's one triangle. We've got another triangle, which is Lytton, who is engaged to Virginia, but being pursued by Dora Carrington. And actually, the thing that's underneath that is he's actually gay. Okay. So he won't really come to fruition with any of the women, but he will have lots of male relationships. And we have Clive Bell, who will end up marrying Vanessa, but in this point in time is in love with both Virginia and with Leonard. So he is completely confused. And in fact, when the day that Leonard and Virginia get married, he's at their wedding ceremony. Very few people are. And he writes a letter to them afternoon declaring his love, his sexual love for both of them. It's a very distraught, bizarre letter. So they are loving in triangles. But at this point, Leonard thinks he has no hope. You know, Virginia is his brother Toby's sister. He's met her, he's liked her, but she's not Jewish. She's in a different class. She's beautiful. And he is a Jewish lower middle class boy working in the civil service. If she's got people like Lytton Strachey and Clive Bell after him, he doesn't think he has a chance. And indeed, it's Lytton who is engaged to her. But Lytton, who is engaged to her, is chickening out. And he knows how Leonard feels. So he sends Leonard a telegram to Ceylon, which says, "Your destiny is clearly marked out for you, but will you allow it to work? You must marry Virginia. She's sitting waiting for you. Is there any objection? She's the only woman in the world with sufficient brains. It's a miracle that she should exist. But if you're not careful, you'll lose the opportunity. She's young, wild, inquisitive, discontented, and longing to be in love." So Leonard comes back then. He hangs out with them a bit, but Virginia is still engaged to Lytton. He goes back because he's got to finish off in Ceylon. 1911, he arranges with Lytton that he'll come home, and Lytton dumps Virginia the day before Leonard will arrive, so that she's then there waiting for Leonard to cry on his shoulder. So very complicated here. And Leonard Woolf, you know, he'd written, "Do you think Virginia would have me? Wire to me if she accepts. I'll take the next boat home." You know, he's obsessed. He loves her. Virginia at that point, Stephen, doesn't feel the same. So she really likes him, and I'll tell you a bit about why. And she's very dependent on him, but she's not attracted. As I told you brutally the other day, I feel no physical attraction in you. There are moments when you kissed me the other day was one when I feel no more than a rock. And yet your caring for me as you do almost overwhelms me. It's so real and so strange. So one of the things that has happened is she has had since 1897, and I'll take that apart in a minute, she has had several spells where she's had serious depression and her mental health has come into question. In 1911, she has been committed to an institution. She has a society doctor. His name is George Savage, and that is a very good name for him. He's actually the man who develops the straitjacket in Britain, and he's a society doctor who works in Bedlam, which is the main mental asylum in London. That's not a nice phrase, but it's what they called it. I worked there in the museum for a while, so I know it quite well, and I've seen some of the items. So what he used to do was he used to experiment on the very poor people who were committed to the asylums, but he'd earn his money by treating the wealthy. She was not sent to Bedlam, she was sent to a place in Twickenham. But his treatment for her, he didn't put her in a straitjacket, but he said she was getting sick because her mind was too busy and it wasn't fit for a woman, and they needed to quieten and deaden her mind. So for several months, he had all her reading material confiscated, as well as her writing implements. So she wasn't allowed to read or write. And he said this was her treatment. It drove her bonkers. And Leonard realised how cruel it was. And he actually, first of all, got her books, he got her writing implements, pen and paper, and then he got her released from this institute by saying he would care for her. So he understood, whereas all her siblings and friends were willing to just go with this treatment. So he really cared for her and she admired that. Where does a lot of that mental health illness come from? She is also from a very complicated family. Her parents marry as second marriages for both of them. So she's got siblings on both sides, and then they have 4 children together. This is not all of them, but it's some of them. And the key figures here are George Duckworth and Gerald sorry, this one's Gerald Duckworth and that's George Duckworth. So Julia, who's the mother was Julia Nay Jackson, had originally married Mr. Duckworth, who died, and she had had Gerald and George, and actually another two sisters, Laura and Stella Duckworth, with her first marriage. We now pretty much know from various diary entries and letters that Gerald for sure, and probably George as well, sexually abused Virginia for many, many years, as well as probably Vanessa too. So this is part of why she broke down. What happened was she had, so Julia died, her mother Julia dies in 1895, and her older sister Stella Duckworth takes on the maternal role, and she actually protects the younger siblings a little bit against Gerald. Stella gets married, but she's going to move nearby and still be the kind of maternal figure for her younger children, her younger brothers and sisters. But she gets sick on honeymoon and dies. We're not quite sure what it is, but she's married in April and she's dead by July of 1897. That starts off what Virginia calls the 7 unhappy years. It's Gerald Duckworth who's mainly responsible for her. Her father, Leslie, is the one who won't let her be educated, won't let the girls be educated. He's very complicated too. And this is when she starts having mental breakdowns. The person who supports her through them is Violet Davidson, who was Stella's best friend. Sorry, so her older sister Stella, who'd been the kind of mother figure to her, Violet had been the best friend, and Violet looks after Vanessa and Virginia a lot. And it's actually thought, and I think they're probably right, that this is Virginia's first sexual relationship with a woman. Anyway, Violet helps her, gets her kind of out after the father dies. Violet helps Adrian and Toby, Virginia and Vanessa, the 4 youngest Stephen siblings, to buy a home and move to Bloomsbury. They sell the family home in South Kensington. They get out from under the Duckworth's thumb, and that's all happy. Well, Violet remains a very close friend, and her correspondence with Virginia is interesting. This is the front of the postcard she sent her, a self-portrait. It's to Violet that Virginia writes when she decides to marry Leonard. My Violet, I've got a confession to make. I'm going to marry Leonard Wolfe. He's a penniless Jew. I'm more happy than anyone ever said was possible, but I insist upon your liking him too. May we both come on Tuesday? Would you rather I come alone? He was a great friend of Toby's, went out to India, came back last summer when I saw him, and he's been living here since the winter. So this is what she says, and of course, that he's a penniless Jew is really interesting. The rest of her social circle look down on this marriage, and she still does it. Other than Lytton, who is desperate to transfer her affections from him to Leonard, and the brother Toby, they are a little bit dismissive of Leonard Wolfe, although he will grow into their circle. This is their wedding, and this is another question about whether it was definitely a loving relationship, but whether it was a sexual one. Maybe after that sexual abuse, she's not capable. I mean, he does something I think is slightly uncomfortable, which is in one of her novels, he writes about their marriage. And he says, you know, Harry is Leonard, Camilla is Virginia. Perhaps you were never made to be able to say, I love you. Harry writes in a letter to Camilla. She assents in her reply, I can't give myself passion, leaves me cold. So it's not a sexual marriage, but it is actually a very, very loving one. I'm not sure we have time to do much, but I have this recording.
Dangerous friend. He took very much against all of us in Bloomsbury towards the end of his life.
To return to your wife, I think you wouldn't hesitate to call her a person of genius. Apart from the evidence of her writings, can you describe any special attributes that marked her out from ordinary people?
She had what I call genius of a combination of imagination and intelligence, which is extremely rare, I think. Normally, she was extremely happy and enjoyed all the usual things of life. But every now and then in conversation, for instance, she would do what I call leave the ground and give a most fantastic account, say, of a perfectly ordinary thing which had happened or which she'd seen, which was like what she does, I think, when she's at her best in her novels.
One can see from...
I'm going to stop it there because we don't have huge amounts of time. And in my last 7 or 8 minutes, I want to talk to you about the Nazi era. But just to say, this is an interview he gave. He adores her, but we also have radio recordings of her talking about him, and it's mutual. And this is, I didn't put the recordings of time, but this is a Q&A from one of the recordings she did for Radio 4, where the interviewer asked her, what was the happiest moment in your whole life? This is 1940. And she replies, I think it's the moment when one is walking in one's garden, perhaps picking off a few dead flowers, and one suddenly thinks, my husband lives in that house and he loves me. Okay. So for all that, she has these amazing, she does have passionate relationships with women. Her relationship with Leonard, the marriage to Leonard, is the core, stable relationship of her life. And she's very happy because of his love for her. And he cares for her. He facilitates her writing. He creates the press. He needs to earn money, but he also does it to publish her work. You know, he will give her whatever she needs and wants. Is it reciprocal? Yes. And I want to show you the shift in politics. So in 1918, she says, it's my natural disposition to think Parliament ridiculous. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. Then Leonard is invited to stand for the Labour Party. If one didn't think that politics were an elaborate game got up to keep a pack of men trained for that sporting condition, one might be dismal. One sometimes is dismal, okay? She's very dismissive of politics. She doesn't particularly need it. This is even after World War One. But he is an incredibly political creature and he will influence and change her. So this is her passport and this is Vita. And in 1929, they go to Germany. They go to boat. They're going because Vita's husband was at the working at the British Embassy. A few of their other friends tour them to see galleries. But she hates Berlin. Leonard is fascinated though. I've done this, I've called it Ich bin kein Berliner. I played off JFK. You know, I am a Berliner or I am a donut. She's like, I'm not a Berliner. She hates Berlin. What a horror Berlin and diplomacy are. Berlin glamour seems only that of Woolworths and Lyons Corner House. Its immeasurable mediocrity still affects me. I suppose Berlin, which is the ugliest of cities, did me in somehow. That was 1929. And yet, she will get a new passport in 1933 to go back to Germany. She and Leonard have to bribe to get the passport visa. They have to bribe Otto Christian Archibald von Bismarck. Yes, that von Bismarck family, who will be the person responsible later for sending many Jews to concentration camps. He's currently serving in the London embassy, and they will get him to get them a passport. Why? Because 1933, with Hitler's rise to power, Leonard has completely seen what is coming. I'm doing a very quick, so I've only got about 3 minutes left, but I'm going to do a very quick thing. I'm introducing you to who they take with them. So Leonard convinces Virginia to go back to Germany with him, and they take Mitz the marmoset, their monkey. This is a better picture. This is me photographing their photo album in the British Library Archive, so please don't reproduce this. But this is their spaniel. I can't remember her name. It's something, is it Lola or something? Anyway, but this is the little marmoset called Mitz, and they take Mitz with. This is Leonard with Mitz on his hand. And everything about the Bloomsbury Group and Virginia has been written about, including Mitz the marmoset has her own biography, would you believe? Anyway, the reason I'm mentioning it, because it's really important, because the whole time they're in Germany, through 1935, Virginia keeps a diary, okay? So they are now in Germany when the Nazis have risen to power. She's with a Jewish husband, okay? And she knows what's happening. Sitting in the sun outside the German customs, a car with a swastika on the back window has just passed through the barrier into Germany. Leonard is in customs. Ought I to go in and see what's happening? The Dutch customs took 10 seconds. This has taken 10 minutes already. The windows are barred. Here they come out, and the grim man laughed at Mitz. We become obsequious. Delighted that that's when the officers smile at Mitzi, the first stoop in our back. So they're not taking Mitzi the marmoset because they love her of all their pets. They take her very cleverly as a distraction. Later the same day, by the Rhine, sitting at the window, we were chased across the river by Hitler or Goering. It was Goering, I double-checked the history. Had to pass through ranks of children with red flags. They cheered Mitzi. I raised my hand. People gathering in the sunshine, rather forced like school sports. Banners stretched across the street. The Jew is our enemy. There's no place for Jews in. So we whizzed along until we got out of range of the docile, hysterical crowd, our obsequiousness gradually turning to anger, nerves rather frayed. Okay? So this Virginia, who has been living through the kind of Bloomsbury's genteel anti-Semitism, is now seeing with her Jewish husband what Hitler's anti-Semitism is really like. And I thought that was a very interesting comment. They cheered Mitzi, I raised my hand. And in fact, if you look at Leonard's version of the same events, when they saw Mitz, the crowd shrieked with delight. Mile after mile, I drove between the two lines of Corybantic Germans, and the whole way they shouted Heil Hitler, to Mitz, and gave her, and secondarily Virginia and me, the Hitler salute with outstretched arm. No one who had on his shoulders such a dear little thing could be a Jew. Okay? By the way, uncapitalized, but it's the Jew writing. Leonard comes back, they come back, and Leonard writes this book, and it is pretty much the first account in Britain that is a documentation of Hitler's Nazism and fascism and a kind of challenge to fascism. He publishes it himself, but then he gets it published by a big publisher because he wants it to be well read. You can see there are different versions. Quack, quack, the fascist quack, he's seeing it coming, and he talks about how the fascists led people out of poverty. He understands the economic imperative, and he looks at how the fascists convince their masses that they're their saviours. He analyses it perfectly, relies on the charismatic, emotional, passionate leader, a quack, who requires that people give up on rational thought and blindly accept the word of the state. It depends on and makes use of people's primal urges. and displays racism for no reason, scapegoating, for example, making conclusions about Jews. You know, this racism for no reason is a big one for him. And Virginia is editing it with him. He writes it, but she's editing it. He's influenced to do it by Louis Golding, one of his best friends, a Jew from Manchester. Again, he is worth sessions on his own. He wrote the most popular, Hogarth Press's publication, Magnolia Street, was the most popular book of 1931. Golding disappeared from view for all sorts of complicated reasons, but because he's Jewish. He supports Leonard Woolf in doing the anti-fascist writing. And in fact, Virginia Woolf herself writes an essay called The Outsider Society, 3 Guineas in 1938. She's talking about pacifism, but she champions Barbara Lee Smith as the outsider who created a school for Catholics and Jews. So she's changed, her politics has shifted because of the time in Germany and because of Leonard. I'm going to finish by, though, just going back to those cases for and against that I started with, because my case for was in her fiction. She made these comments about Jews. Let's just look at the dates of them. 1937 and 1938. People are complicated. She's actively campaigning against racism, against Hitler's fascism. She's a pacifist, but she's supporting Leonard and Louis Golding in their campaigns, their awareness to support Jews. And at the same time, she is using casually anti-Semitic stereotypes. That defense about people having different attitudes, not as bad as some of her best friends were, well, yes, absolutely. And I've shown you how much her circles were Jewish. But I just want to compare her to E.M. Forster, one of the Bloomsbury group, at the same time. In 1939, she's publishing stories which still have anti-Semitic caricatures. He publishes an article, Jew Consciousness, which concludes we have to shift from that public school anti-Semitism, because to me, anti-Semitism is now the most shocking of all things. So it doesn't quite hold up. This famous passage to India, he worked with a Jewish woman, Ruth Prawajar, you might know, to turn it into a film, the Merchant Ivory films that are born. So there's a whole story there too. But I'm just going to finish here, which is I have done on the one hand and on the other hand about the complications of her anti-Semitism. But you know, how we as Jews perceive her versus how others perceive her. There was a Nazi handbook that was discovered by British secret agents from 1940. I talked a bit last week about the German invasion of the Channel Islands and their plans for the invasion of Britain. And this was the list that they compiled, which Hitler's list, should they invade Britain, who were the first people that they would target. It was a list of who were the people they were going to capture and imprison or sentence to death. Winston Churchill, Sigmund Freud, E.M. Forster, H.G. Wells, and Virginia and Leonard Woolf. So how Hitler and the Nazis perceived her and Leonard was as huge threats to them. So who should be afraid of Virginia and Leonard Woolf? Well, both the Jews and the fascists. Thank you very much. You're muted, Sherelle.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. And I'll ask some of the questions that I received during the chat. One, maybe a very kind of initial one, is the fact that Jews generalize about themselves. We say stuff about themselves. Can we see what Virginia Woolf was writing as the same type of generalization without putting on it an anti-Semitic lens?
Can I give a both and answer?
Yes.
I think some of those comments, particularly the diaries, I did say quite a lot of them were about her mother-in-law. you know, she was actually very, very funny, and a lot of those were jokes. And she was not afraid of making generalizations or ripping into people for the amusement of her friends in her salon. And she could be quite sharply sarcastic and cruel in that way. So I think, yes, some of it was, and some of it is buying into how Gertler or Cott or any of them present themselves. I think she is also, and I'm looking at the dates, you know, the fact that that doesn't change, you know, E.M. Forster is complicit in all of that, but what he sees with the rise of fascism is it's no longer okay to do that. And that Forster and Virginia Woolf, by this point, are really important people in British society. He shifts his perspective that she can't and keeps doing it even though she knows better. That's what makes me uncomfortable.
Okay. I'll squeeze in one more question. There was a question if we know of any responses of Leonard Woolf to those writings.
So most of the time he just adores her and doesn't say anything critical. There are a few things where about that essay, Three Guineas I talked about, you know, he goes to the, well, she's a pacifist, you know, I am an anti-fascist, but she's a pacifist, and we've got to be open to that. He's also very protective of the other people in his circle who critique her because of the mental health issues. However, this is a piece of research yet to be done. I was talking to someone in Philadelphia last year who, as a graduate student, became Leonard Woolf's amanuensis and said there are lots of Leonard Woolf's papers that haven't yet been really explored. And so I don't want to give you an answer that isn't true because I don't know if in any of those papers there are things, but it's kind of one of the next things on my list to look at.
Amazing. So one of many reasons to have you back. Before I conclude, we have also a special gift or kind of perk for CSP learners. So maybe if you can share that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about building this relationship with CSP. So I had a chat to my board at Jewish Renaissance because we are hoping to publish more of Shirel's work and have her talk. And I'm hoping I'll be back here. So we've made an offer for you that's going to get sent round that you can get an offer, reduced offer, if you do want to subscribe to our magazine. And you can do that digitally or in print. So I think Shirel should put that into the email that follows up tomorrow.
Yes. You'll receive that all in the follow-up email. As we usually have the follow-up email within 24 hours, we give ourselves a grace of 72 in case the world turns over twice in a day. But you'll receive it all in the follow-up email. Aviva, thank you so much. I don't know if you're seeing the chat. It's just like a string of well-deserved compliments. For those of you who missed one or more of the 3 parts that were prior to this one, you'll receive the links in the follow-up email, and you can always see them also on our YouTube channel. Aviva, thank you. This was amazing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me test out my research and being with me. Lovely to see you all.